Welcome back to Unboxing OD. I'm your host, Kenneth Pearson, and in this episode, I'm joined by Marcus Dudley for a thoughtful, straight talk conversation about leadership that actually moves the needle. We explore why so many leadership programs feel like box checking and what it takes to build something sturdier, clear expectations, space to practice, real feedback, and coaching that challenges assumptions. We also look at leadership beyond the office, how the way we work shows up at home and in our communities, and how better conversations, active listening, and shared clarity can change the tone of a week. Marcus introduces performance drag as a practical lens for spotting what slows leaders down, gaps in strategic clarity, underdeveloped leadership behaviors, and a reluctance to leverage technology. We talk about cadence and accountability, the difference between leadership and management, and the moment AI stops being a buzzword and becomes time you get back for your people. There's even a cautionary story about a SWAT that sat on a shelf and cost real money, plus how to avoid repeating it. So grab that cup of coffee and let's dive in. I'm joined today by Marcus Dudley. Marcus Dudley is a leadership and organizational consultant, executive coach, professor, and CEO of Mammoth Leadership and Organizational Development. With over 30 years of experience across the military, sports, nonprofit, and business worlds, he helps ambitious leaders and business owners eliminate performance drag and get big results faster. He's the creator of the Modern Leadership Scorecard and author of Mammoth Success, a practical guide to strategic clarity, leadership growth, and AI-driven productivity. Marcus is known for his no-fluff, straight-talk, real-world approach to building high-performing leaders and organizations. And I want to say, welcome, Marcus. I'm so happy we had a chance to talk just a little bit before this. And I really like this. Marcus is known for his no-fluff, straight talk. I like that. So, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Kenneth, and thanks so much again for having me. We talked a little bit about this being such an underserved and undervalued, I think, profession, and I certainly think it's something that needs more exposure and needs more conversation. And it's really a privilege to be able to add to these conversations. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I appreciate it as well, and I know that this is, I mean, we talked a little bit beforehand, and I've said this numerous times on the podcast. Like this podcast started based on the question, what is OD, and a lot of it too. It started with, the question, what is OD, that I constantly got, or what is organizational development? And then I had gone to ATD Org Dev last year in Atlanta. And I remember the first keynote speaker, and it was great because she was a last minute first keynote, the first keynote, because somebody had canceled beforehand. So they asked her to come in, and she had like 2 or 3 days to get the presentation together. But it just was ingrained in me. So it hit me and resonated so much that I actually talk about her in the first podcast. So, looking at organizational development from a human-centered perspective, like that's really where it comes from. Like we talk about, we were talking a little bit about, like data and all that stuff, going into it, like AI, we'll talk a little bit about AI, but really at the end of the day, organizational development, the initiatives, everything is all people-centered, because none of the work that we do can get done without the help of other people,
right?
Actually doing the work and actually helping us with the work. So yeah. So thank you so much for being on podcast.
Well, again, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So Marcus, so you've been in leadership across so many spaces: military, sports, nonprofits, business. When you think about everything you've seen and done, what's the general thread, or what's the thread that keeps pulling you back to help leaders get better?
It's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure that there's a linear answer to it. I think pretty early on, even back in high school, I really started to understand kind of the relationship between results and good leadership, right? Or results and bad leadership, for that matter. And I think, as I kind of got into the military and was around a lot of what I would consider highly trained leaders, it gave me a lot of good models to start um, looking at my own leadership style and starting to kind of develop those skills. And really my focus was on how do I become a better leader and how do I, help others be as successful as they can be in whatever roles or responsibilities that they have. And then that kind of morphed into, how do I help other members of my team become better leaders? And then that morphed into how do I help other organizations develop leaders? And now it's really, I think as I don't know how old you are, Kenneth, but now that I've kind of surpassed 50, you start thinking about kind of what's your contribution to society. What have I done? What am I doing? And I think, you know, because of that thread of, better leaders equal better outcomes and better results, uh, my focus has really been on how many people can I help become better leaders? Because ultimately that's going to mean that there's going to be better outcomes in their families and on their teams and in their organizations and in their communities. And so that's really, I think, been maybe the common thread is how do I help contribute to that legacy, and that then they can contribute to the future legacy of future leaders as well.
Yeah, I love that. Especially so of everything that you said, the one thing that really stuck out to me was the family and the community. Like how are the interventions? And I think of that from an OD perspective, not just on a leadership, not on the leadership plane, but also on change initiatives. So when we're looking at change and we're looking at, how does, not just why this change has to happen. How does this impact the employee, the frontline employee, the individual contributor, the leader? How does it, impact the middle manager? How does it impact each individual, not just at work, but what are they bringing home with them? Because that's Rich, you're saying the really important part to there is, if we have individuals that are not happy at work, that are stressed and angry, and they go home, they bring that home to their families. And sometimes they can, people can hide it, but a lot of times, like they might, withdraw, or they might, lash out, and they might impact their husband or wife or spouse or their children, their parents, whomever it might be. And those individuals are then impacted, and they bring that out into the community. And then it's just this cycle of,
Right.
and it's this cycle of just, this stress and, just being, we'll talk about ripple effects and everything here in a little bit, but it's just this ripple out. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the understanding and actually acknowledging, um, family, community, the workplace and everything. Because I know for myself with um, IO psychology and studying that, like I had gotten into organizational development prior to, starting to study IO psychology. But when I got into IO psychology, it really, really um, brought my understanding of the workforce to a much higher level,
Sure.
because it went from, how are we impacting the work, to how are we impacting the family, how are we impacting the community, and really looking at it from a full holistic approach. I happen to work in tribal government as well,
Oh
so
yeah, sure.
a lot of the services, individuals that lived in the community also worked, for the tribal government. So it really was how is it impacting the community?
Yeah.
How is it impacting the services that we're providing? So
Yeah.
yeah, so I appreciate that very much.
Well, and it's a two-way street, right? I mean, it doesn't just flow from work to the home; it flows from home back to work too. And and these skills, I think that we talk about, from organizational development, aren't just relevant to the workplace. I mean, learning how to manage conflict, learning how to manage change, learning how to have better conversations, with the members of your family. All those things are transferable skills, right? So, they're not just for leadership, they're for human interactions. And I think you're right. I think these things are very interconnected, you know, um, and and I think it's important for leaders to think about the reverse of that. I think oftentimes leaders only think about how their performance is at work, and what's impacting that, but they don't ask themselves what's going on in their homes or their communities that may be impacting their morale or their energy or their motivation for doing a good job at work, and how can we as leaders be more supportive or aware or empathetic of those situations so that we can help them, be the best that they can be at work, and hopefully translate that back to their homes and then communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And they whatever you want to call them, soft skills, durable skills, human skills, it
Yeah.
depends on who you talk to, think to get the understanding.
Right.
I mean, they are transferable skills. And then I used to, um, I still do. I really, really emphasize, understanding communication, understanding emotional intelligence, understanding active listening, nonverbal communication, work ethic, teamwork, collaboration, like all of these skills, negotiation, influence. That
Right.
is one of the best skills that you could possibly have, and nobody really trains on.
Right. Right.
So hint, hint, wink, wink. Okay, you need to
Right.
set something up for that there.
Yeah, sure.
So, but that's that these are the skills that are exactly what you're saying, that are transferable to life. You become a better active listener. And I used to teach this, you know, or train to this in the organization. You become a better active listener. Yes, you become a better coworker, become a better employee.
Sure.
Great, but you also become a better, significant other, a better
Right.
parent, a better child, whatever, because you're actually listening to the people that are in your life. You're actually taking an interest in them and engaging with them. And active listening is such an amazing communication
Right.
skill, even though it's a separate skill. It is such an amazing communication skill because it's you're not saying anything. You're just
Right.
listening and real. I mean, it's amazing. It's
And
amazing
it's
how
not a focus of most leadership development programs. I mean, really,
right.
maybe a little bit, but it's not a high, not a, when you're looking at, the curriculum, it's not one of the top 10 things that they probably pull out. At least not that I find. It's usually in there in basic communication skills, but not enough times focused on it, and the impacts that it can really have on your relationships, both internally and externally of an organization. So yeah, 100% agree
Yeah.
with that sentiment.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit before this too, and you said before that most leadership development programs are broken. So let's open that up a little bit. So
Yeah.
what do you think they're consistently missing, and why is it still playing out the same way?
Yeah, this may not be a popular topic for some members, some of your viewers, but we'll dig into it. I think there's a lot wrong with the current processes. With the status quo, uh, and I think it stems primarily. And when I'm talking about leadership development, I'm talking about it from an academic perspective, academic institutions, talking about corporate L&D programs, primarily. And I think a lot of the issue stems from this myth that somehow the transference of knowledge and information to specific individuals in specific roles with specific responsibilities equals development. And that's just a fallacy. It's not how it works. With any new knowledge, you need time to practice, you need feedback, you need, a safe environment to practice these skills in which you don't feel like making a mistake is going to be some career limiting, uh, you know, uh, situation. And so all of those things I think are really necessary in terms of having an effective leadership development program. So it kind of starts with this myth, right? It's just information and you get it and you're supposed to somehow be able to utilize it through osmosis, which, just doesn't work. Um, but then I think that there's several other, issues. And, you know, I would say that part of it starts with the amount of time that we spend on leadership development. I think oftentimes organizations feel like they're checking a box. They're going to go through a leadership orientation or a leadership retreat or a couple-day workshop here or an annual refresher here, and somehow that's supposed to lead to this influx of knowledge and this and then how do we translate that into applicable skill sets. But leadership isn't that way, right? It's a lifelong journey, that's filled full of peaks and valleys and plateaus. And it takes more time to learn those skills. And just because, and we talked a little bit about this, I think, before, is just because you're taught information doesn't mean that you're in the situation to apply it at that time, to really utilize it. And so you forget it. So that's the first I think, issue is that these programs aren't long enough. Whether it's a semester, whether it's a workshop, whether it's once a year, whether it's one time, they're just not long enough to really develop leaders and prepare them to handle the challenges that the leaders face. The second issue that I see a lot of in working with organizations is just the complexity. That I think some people believe that complexity equals value or more value. And leaders don't need more complexity. We need simplicity. I don't care how great a model is. If you can't remember it, you're not going to use it. So I think we need to spend a lot of time, simplifying these things, or at least making them as accessible as possible. And that was one of the, kind of driving factors behind my book was how can I create a resource where, a leader can say, okay, I'm not going to remember this model. There's too many out there, but where's my Swiss Army knife that I can go, okay, conflict management, let's quickly refer to this and not have to look it up online, but have a quick resource that they could pull from their desk or pull from their phone to kind of utilize, to kind of think about that specific situation. So I think complexity, we need to simplify things and make it more accessible for leaders to use. And then I think the last piece that, and it's kind of twofold, is you have to provide support for these leaders. There's not enough coaching. And I think people confuse or don't realize that leadership and coaching aren't the same things. And, it's one thing to obtain knowledge and information. It's another thing to have a safe, confidential environment, I think, to really sit down and talk through and reflect upon, how you're utilizing this new information or applying these new skills, or to have someone who will push back on your assumptions or, hold you accountable to certain things that you say that you're going to do and work on. And I think that the vast majority of leadership development programs that I find don't have those built-in support structures or the coaching pieces, in place to help leaders develop over time. So, I know I talked about a lot of different things there, but, that's why I feel the system's broken and it doesn't properly prepare. And all of those things need to get kind of fixed or addressed in order, I think, to really start developing the type of leaders that we need, um, at work and in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree with you that there needs to be more it needs to be simplified, but it needs to be more in depth. And it really needs to meet the learner and the leader where they are. So, I know when I first got into, training and development, it was like, all right, I'm going to do a presentation. This is good and great. I did this wonderful presentation. I don't understand why nobody knows, what I'm talking about and everything. And I was like, oh, this is great. The words are great, this and everything else. But over time, I realized like that's not the style that our workforce at that time needed.
Right.
And it's really important in there too that it's, that we meet the organization where the organization,
For sure.
needs their leadership. It's not just blanket. I mean, there's some good organizations out there that provide, leadership training that you can get
Right.
generic leadership trainings, like LinkedIn. You can get anything on
Sure.
YouTube. You can get
Right.
anything,
You
all of
can get the knowledge. You can get the
yeah, you can get the
information.
knowledge.
Sure.
Exactly. But is it going to stick?
Right.
And I know exactly what you're talking about. Like when we developed the leadership development program at my previous employment, when we went through the pilot program, it was primarily, we developed a textbook, which was great. It was primarily presentation, a little bit of, real world, work and everything.
Right.
But we realized during that pilot program that the employees or the participants really, really enjoyed the real case scenarios, so case scenarios. So what we did was we developed the knowledge transfer, was for each one of these, we developed it was a 7-month program. So we actually developed a
Great.
seven
Yeah.
month program. And it was, we had maybe 5 to 10 minute videos per month. We had, maybe 20 pages to read in the textbook. We had an exam, all good and great. Okay. But then what we did was we ensured that, we had once a month, we met for a few hours and did all real world scenarios. So all case scenarios. And that's all we did for the 3 hours is just getting into that.
Yeah.
Then we also once a month, talk about the support. We developed a networking group. So for those participants, they would go into this networking opportunity. I would pull myself out because we talked a little bit about OD and HR and everything like that. So
Right.
I was under the OD, I was under the HR umbrella. So I pulled myself out of that. I facilitated a little bit, but put them into little 3 or 4 person groups so they can talk about certain topics and the things that they were experiencing. And then so they had that. And then they also, talking about the coaching, they had the option of meeting with an OD professional, either myself or the other gentleman that was there, on a one-on-one coaching session for 30 minutes to an hour once a month if they wanted
Right.
to go over whatever they might have been experiencing. And I found that, and they also, on top of it, they also had to do group work in a final project that was relevant to the organization, et cetera, et cetera. That was at the end. But I found that once we developed that model, and again, overall super complex, but when it was delivered, it's not that complex.
Right.
It's these little areas, and developed in a way that, when I left, anybody who had the knowledge can take over and facilitate.
Yeah.
So it's not like
It's
it's just
repeatable.
like, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. But with that, we found that the information was retained a little bit better. We tied it. I mean, I'm not going to go further into this, but we tied it to the participants needed to then enter our mentorship program, and they were required to, once they completed, do 6 months of mentoring to mentees throughout the organization. And then the top performers in there would actually be encouraged to apply towards, there's a local leadership program called Greater Tucson Leadership here,
Yeah.
which is a wonderful program. It's a 9-month program. They would be encouraged to apply to that, which if they got accepted, we would cover. So we're
Right.
talking about a leadership program that could potentially be 22 months in
Yeah.
duration, while we also provide these leadership, these micro and macro leadership trainings throughout every single month, so that leaders can come in and get refreshers on
Yeah.
certain topics and stuff. And like I said, I mean, everything, we talk about organizational development. I mean, and this is just on a leadership level. Everything is, it's not just organizational development. And this is the biggest misconception we're talking about. Organizational development isn't just training. That's 10% of what we do.
Right.
It's the back end. It's making sure that, like, you have these abilities to provide, um, provide the support and growth opportunities for employees at every level, not just leaders. It's employees at every single level. So that's why, I'm pretty passionate about what you talked about, like
Yeah,
leadership
for sure.
being broken. You know.
Well, and I think you are talking about something that's more rare than you probably realize. I think a lot of people don't look at. I mean, that sounds like a great program, and it's very in depth. Like you said, it's in depth because it has a lot of components to it. It has all of the pieces that I talked about are commonly missing, right? The support structure, the content, the ability to go into practice, the ability to have some feedback, and to talk about, you know, uh, um, how is it going? How, did you try this? What was your experience like? What would you have done differently? All of those are important conversations. Um, but I think a lot of organizations feel like they're checking a box, and maybe they provide a mentee, but a mentee, is not the same as having a third party coach either. I don't think, because oftentimes you don't want to admit that you've made a mistake to a mentee because they often have some influence over your potential career projection. And so you're not always as forthright. I found with some of those individuals. And I'll be honest. A couple of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, even as a nonprofit CEO, I didn't understand the value of coaching. I always kind of associated it with you need coaching, because you have some deficiencies. And what I found was that's absolutely not what it's about. It's much more, I can't imagine how much more effective I would have been had I had a place to just sit and talk through some of these things. Because people don't really talk about the pressures of leadership either at any level. Um, And I think especially going through COVID, there's a lot of you wear a lot of different hats. You have a lot of different pressures, and you don't have a lot of sometimes peers to talk about some of those things, or the comfort level to be able to talk about some of those things. And it's so, I think, helpful and beneficial to have a place to talk through some of that stuff. And like I said before, someone to kind of challenge your assumptions when you're making assumptions about certain things. And maybe those assumptions are correct, maybe they're not, but it's nice to have someone to push back and kind of ask you, some valid questions that help you kind of take a step back and reflect on some of your own behaviors and actions. And so I know we've gone off a little bit, down a tangent in a hole there, but I absolutely think that you're right. If you go back to my first comment about how important leadership and leadership development is, and how impactful it has on the end result, then I don't understand why organizations don't spend more time and money on it. They don't spend and invest, and I don't think they do a very good job of really. They may analyze the cost of the training and the coaching and the time spent out of office. They don't do a very good job calculating and quantifying the impact of poor leadership, what it means for inefficiency or attrition or morale, right, or motivation, and that's a hard thing to quantify, which I think makes it sometimes more difficult to want to invest in. So it's a circular issue that I think we constantly kind of fight. And that's why, examples like you are so important as case studies, right? To look at how did it impact the organization 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, because that stuff can really, I think, help people in the OD and HR world and L&D world, have some ammunition for increasing their budgets to do more of this type of work, which I think is important too.
So one of the terms that I saw that I really like is you use the term performance dread.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are some of the biggest things you see slowing leaders down that they don't even, so that they often don't even notice?
Yeah. I developed this term, as a way to kind of articulate, I think, the gap between effort and kind of results, right? I think if you've been in a leadership role, that sometimes there's just this feeling like, why is my team just not able to make the progress that I think we should be able to make, that we're capable of making. And so that's kind of where the philosophy or concept came from, right? Well, what's dragging me back? What's getting in my way? What's preventing me from making the progress that we need to make? And so it really, well, there's a variety, numerous, micro, reasons that happens. I think most of them can kind of fall into 3 buckets. One is around strategic clarity, right? It's really making sure that that you and the organization or members of your team know, what's the mission, what's the vision, what's what is the strategy, what are our goals, what are our objectives, what are my roles and responsibilities, all of those pieces, what are the benchmarks and milestones that we need to measure this. That's kind of one category. And I see a lot of deficiencies among leaders and within organizations in that kind of category. The second is really around leadership effectiveness. And, I think we all want to be good leaders and known as good leaders and think that we probably are pretty good leaders, but we don't know what we don't know. And, I mentioned this earlier, it's such a lifelong process of development that, there's always room for becoming a more effective leader, and how that impacts execution, both for yourself and as the members of your team. And so oftentimes I'll see, there's opportunities, in individuals' skill sets that is prohibiting them from helping them and themselves and their team make the progress that they need. And the third, I think, area that I really have started looking into is how to utilize technology and leverage technology. And it's been an issue, I think, for a long time. But I think for most leaders, we get bogged down, right? I mean, we get caught up in distractions and fighting fires. And oftentimes I think new technology is seen as that's going to be a waste of time, or it's going to be an investment of time that we may not have. And we don't really properly calculate, what the benefit of that return on that investment is in terms of efficiency and productivity. both for ourselves and for the members of our teams. So really, when I'm looking at organizations or individuals for that matter, I'm looking for where those points of drag are. And the reality is we all have drag. Nobody's perfect. But it's at what time, how much drag is coming from those specific buckets, and then what can we do in terms of working together or finding out information or developing skill sets that help you minimize that drag so that you can make more steady, sustained progress to reach your goals. I think in a much faster way.
Yeah, and I, especially that first point in there, the clarity. I mean that is so important on every single level within an organization. We talked a little bit before about it. It's just so much easier for us to do our jobs, or execute our jobs, whatever the case is, if we know what we're supposed to be doing. And I've had jobs where I've known like this is what you need to do, and
Right.
I was, from my perspective and from my performance evaluation perspectives, I was pretty successful. Um, and then I've had other jobs where it's like, well, yeah, no, you need to do this today. And then I do this today. And then I come in the next day and it's like, well, no, you weren't supposed to do that yesterday. And it's like, okay, well, it's like,
What am I
well, I
supposed
don't
to be
know.
doing? Right.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing right now. Please tell me what I'm supposed to be doing. So, and often sometimes it even exists within, like, that disparity exists within the organization. So you can go
For
from
sure.
job to job and department to department, and it's just one department you have all the information you need, and in the other department you have nothing. And I've been in roles like that too. When I came into one of my previous roles, I walked in and nobody had any idea what this particular position did because the person before left no information. The manager had no idea really what they did. They were just supervising, just kind of showing up and no idea. And I walked into this time. They're like, well, you'll just figure it out on your own. I was like, well, no. And
I'll
then
get
I
to
did.
sign it. That's great.
By the way, that's what I did. I was like, great. So you're telling me I have a blank canvas here. Great. This is what we're going to do.
Perfect.
But then I was promoted, or moved to a different department in the same organization, and completely different approach. Like I walked in, this is what my expectation were, because there were different just structures within the
Sure.
organization. So I think that you talking about the clarity in there, and I mean I can go, for lack of time today, we can have a conversation for like 4 or 5 hours on all this stuff.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, this is the stuff I like to nerd out and geek out on and stuff. It's just talking about this, but I want to be respectful of your time as well. So yeah. So like I said, I align with a lot of what you're talking about here. So it's really important for those of you that are listening, that are hearing on the podcast. Really, first and foremost, understand expectations, clarity, get that. And it's not just from, so we normally talk about it from a leadership perspective. But we need to be able to, as individuals, as individual contributors, we need to feel empowered enough to say, okay, what are my expectations? What do you expect from me to be able to do? And I know not a lot of people are like that, and not a lot of people can, 'cause a lot of people are afraid maybe of managers, or, those types of, like they're afraid of that type of power. But really, as individuals, as individual contributors, even if we are in a managerial space, we're a lot of time reporting to a supervisor. It's really, really important for us to have that empowerment, to ask for that clarity, to ask for those expectations. Because again, I don't work well in chaos. I'm a very structured
Right.
individual. And I know a lot of people don't work well in chaos. Some people do. Some people actually thrive in it.
Right.
I do not. I do not.
Hmm.
Yeah. So actually, let's talk a little bit about Mammoth success. So let's talk about a little bit
Sure.
about your Mammoth success, because you really dig into that, that clarity and that execution. So why do you think so many leaders struggle with clarity, and how does that confusion ripple out into their teams?
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on a lot of it, right? I mean, it shows up in a lot of different ways, but I think why people struggle comes down to two primary components. First is just the process. I don't think people are taught really how to do strategic planning. I think it's really common for people to have a SWOT or a PESTLE, evaluation, and they get in a room with a bunch of whoever their key personnel is, and they, you know, throw a bunch of shotgun issues at the board and put it on the board, and then try to, consolidate it into groups of things, and then they negotiate for what they think is going to be the most important. And that kind of gets back to the crap in, crap out, right? If that's your way, there's a high likelihood that it's not going to be as effective as you think it's going to be. So I think there's a huge issue with process, in my opinion. And I think one of the benefits of coming from a background in OD is we tend to look at organizations through a variety of different lenses. And that's how I recommend that leaders actually run SWOTs. I think they should do 4 SWOTs, 4 separate SWOTs, by looking at through 4 different lenses of the organization. And I call it the 4 Ps of organizational performance. But I really focus on leaders looking at their organizations through first kind of their purpose and their mission, right? Where is it? What are we doing? Why are we here? Where are we going? All the things we kind of talked about in terms of clarity and making sure that, where are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in that area. I'll use SWOT as the general framework for that. And then we look at our products and services. What are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities with our products and services? And we kind of come up with all that information. We move to processes and systems, right? There's so many processes and systems, that kind of help us manage an organization from a variety of different ways. So we need a lot of, we need to reframe our brain to think about what are the strengths and weaknesses, in opportunities in that area. And then it kind of moves to people and relationships, right? What's the culture like? How are we developing people? Are we our succession planning? What's the morale like? What's the culture like? What's the motivation like? What's our relationship with our customers and our vendors and our partners and our stakeholders? And I think when you kind of do that SWOT for all 4 of those groups, it gives you enough information to really take a step back and say, okay, where are we going? Which one of these, we can't do it all. Which are our top priorities? What's going to help us if we tackle these in the next year or whatever, 2 years, whatever the time frame that we're planning out is? How can we, we need to get some alignment around what are our most important and most impactful goals, and making them smart goals, and then making smart tactics. And so I see a lot of problems with just that process, identifying the right information to make the right decisions. But then, it comes down to having these goals and then developing the tactics underneath those goals, and what is everyone responsible for? Who's going to do it? When is it going to be due by? How are we going to track this? And I think you're right. It's so important to have this information, right? And it's not that these things can't change, because they absolutely can, I think, but it's the process of developing that is the first issue, and making sure you have a sound strategic plan. And then it's not setting it on a shelf and forgetting about it, right? It's like, how do we constantly revisit this? And how do we as leaders make sure that we're not getting distracted ourselves, and that we're constantly referring back to this living document and saying, where are you at on this, Kenneth? Where, what are your objectives over the next, whatever week, next 30 days, whatever. And what do you need from me to help you, obtain those goals? And then being willing to make adjustments when those challenges happen, and to modify those plans, to make sure that you're making progress, and then having, the structure in place, to have those conversations and to measure progress and hold people accountable and all those things. And I think when you have that structure, it's not that hard to have the conversations. As a leader, I feel like you should be having those conversations. I don't necessarily feel like it was my employees' responsibility to come to me and say, what am I supposed to be doing? If they are asking me that, that's because I didn't help them uncover that, and I haven't helped them find alignment. And that gets back to this drag issue, right? Everyone's wasting time at that point, right? We're not focused on what we really need to be focused on. And so we're going in a lot of different directions, and that's costing us time and money and energy and all of those things that I think are really kind of getting in the way of us achieving goals that we're really there to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that exactly what you said toward the end there. And if we're doing our job as leaders and managers, employees aren't going to have to come to us and ask us what
Right.
we need to do. And again, if they are, that's a failure on our part that we're not providing that. I know that ideally we want all leaders to be this way,
Yeah.
like that they be, but realistically, not all leaders are. And that's why, I really specifically said that if you don't
Yeah.
know, you got to ask,
I totally understand that.
Yeah.
But I also think that's part of the leadership development piece, right? That we're talking
Right.
about
Right.
when you're talking about giving individual skill sets, right?
Mhm.
Um, and we've kind of, you know, there's leadership and management skills, and a lot of these things we call leadership development is really management development. And oftentimes those two terms are used interchangeably, and both of them are extremely important skill sets to have. But it's shocking to me sometimes how little training and development has gone into helping leaders and managers um, get really clear on the goals and their priorities and how to develop, you know, um, that into to goals and tactics that can be achieved. And that's why it's such a big piece of the model for me is if you can get that right, it solves a lot of the issues. And then I think the other thing too is being understanding enough as a leader to know that shit's going to change. You can't hold people accountable to the same thing a year later, right? If you haven't been taking the time to say, what are the challenges? What are you facing? What do we need to change? What resources do we have to help you overcome those challenges? How can I be of support to you to overcome those challenges? And you're right. If we're not seeing that, it's opportunities for, more strategic clarity. It's opportunities for more leadership effectiveness, which are, the core issues that I've kind of been talking about from a drag perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know like exactly what you're talking about. I mean, it's, so Marcus, just, we're like, I'm on a really good understanding.
Good.
We have a lot of the same, a lot of the same philosophies, a lot of the same approaches. And I know, you know, exactly what you're talking about too. Like some in there, like having one-on-ones and meeting with your team members. A lot of mistakes are one-on-ones are, please tell me what you're doing. This is the way managers approach it. And
Right.
again, there's an episode, I forget what number episode it is, that I did that actually talks about the distinction between leadership versus management.
Right.
I did it for part of my course study. It was required to, so there's some research
Sure.
backed information on there. But when we get into these one-on-ones, sometimes you get some of these managers, not leaders, that get in, or we call them leaders, but we'll say from a managerial
Right.
perspective, that just want to know what you're doing. Like, give me an update. And
Right.
a lot of stuff, I mean, and I used to train leaders on that all the time. Like that stuff, like that's an email. Like, give me a
Right.
bullet pointed email where you are in your tasks, in what you're supposed to be doing. Just tell me where you are with it. That's all I need. I don't need to
Right.
spend an hour with you talking about your tasks.
Yeah.
What I need to do is I need to spend a half an hour with you talking about exactly what you're talking about. What barriers are you experiencing? How do I support you? How do we evolve? How do I provide you growth opportunities? And that's been my approach, in terms of leadership, is to be that supportive individual, within the workplace, and have those one-on-ones. Exactly what you're saying. Like those goals, that strategy, it evolves over time. You know.
Yeah, I think you touch on something that's really important too. I mean, if you're asking people to tell you what they're doing, they're going to justify what they're doing, right? You're not
Yeah.
asking the right question, right? The right question is, if you already have clarity around what they should be doing, the question is what challenges are you having? What can I? That's the whole conversation. You know, you can ask where they are, but really, what I want to know is what challenges are you having? What can I do to help you? Right? Do you feel like you're behind? Do you feel like you're on track? Do you feel like I don't need to know all of it, but I do need to know if you're having issues, and I do need to know that I'm there to help you. To do that. This isn't a constant weekly performance evaluation. That's not how I look at it. Because then you're going to sugarcoat stuff that I may really need to know that can help you make the progress that you need. And so, but again, I think that these are skill sets that we need to spend a lot more time training managers and leaders. And I don't look at these as two different roles. I mean, I've met some people that are amazing managers and terrible leaders. I met people that are amazing leaders and terrible managers. I really look at these as the most effective leaders that I know are individuals who know when to manage and know when to lead and know when those skill sets are needed, and how to balance the utilization of those skills, because they are different skill sets. And I think organizations need to understand that too, that, leadership isn't just for the C-level individuals. I mean, you need, leaders and managers need both of those skill sets really, and developing them very much early on. I don't know why we don't do more of this in college, even at the undergraduate level, to help people develop some of these skills that can make them more effective at managing and leading. And you're right; it's a never-ending cycle, but it's another huge source of drag, right? Because when you're inefficient with this, or people don't understand the intention of having these conversations, then you don't get the information you need to make the changes that are necessary to keep progress moving.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you talk about that growth in there, that constant learning, for us as individuals and us as leaders. And I also like to say, I generally tell people, all managers are managers, but not all managers are leaders,
For
and not
sure.
all leaders are managers, and that's where it is. I mean, it's, leadership is, both of them are skill sets, and they're two distinct skill sets.
For
And
sure.
um, and management, when we look at management and everything, it really is, a management of, like, let's say, human capital management, technology management. It's management over processes and systems. It's management of a program.
Sure.
Leadership is really about that more of that human, like that human centered approach. That how are you helping your team grow? How are you how are you growing yourself? How are you inspiring others within the workforce? I mean,
Yeah.
that's exactly what it is. I mean, that's two separate skill sets. Like, you have to be a manager, you have to understand those management skills, but you also have to understand the leadership skills in there. So when we did part of that soft skills and human skills training, leadership was a part of that, because leadership is a skill that's based around people. Not that management isn't, but management is more process, and that's where we did a lot of that training in there. So, I do like that distinction, and creating that distinction in there between the two. So,
Yeah, and they overlap for sure,
oh
and
yeah,
and
100%.
you need, yeah, but they're not the same thing. I think that's the major point that people need to realize.
Right,
And I think we know that inherently. But, you look at some of these leadership development programs and you look at them and go, this isn't a leadership development program at all. This is a management preparation program. That's what this is. It's not, you're not developing leaders with this. And it's all process based, there's no human based. Or it's like, how do you manage a difficult conversation? How do you manage if you, you're giving a little bit into that, but it's just the process. It's the frameworks. It's not really, you're not really teaching leadership. Um, so yeah, I think this is an important distinction that I think needs to be talked about more. And I think for OD and HR people, and for business leaders, I think it's one that people need to take a step back and kind of reflect a little bit on. Are we developing only managers, or are we developing managers who have leadership skills, who can continue to grow and develop those skills as they progress through their careers?
Yeah, yeah, and really important in there too. Really important thing that you're saying is that I'm interpreting is when we're developing these leadership development programs, or if you're an OD professional and you're developing these leadership programs, you need to have that balance.
For sure.
I know, like, for example, like, 1 month we spent on technology management and human capital management and the management of those particular the areas. But we also, we did our fundamentals of public service leadership and motivation. So we focused on community facing. We focused on customer service. We focused on different active listening, communication,
Right.
negotiation, and influence. Like, we focused on those particular areas. So there was a balance, and it's not just about leadership. Like, managers still need to know how to be managers as
For
well. They still
sure.
need to manage their teams, manage their programs, manage a budget. You have to know how to manage a budget
For
when you
sure.
are
Yeah.
when you're at a managerial or C-suite level, director level. Like, you need to know how to manage the budget.
Right.
So you have to have fiscal training is that leadership. Fiscal responsibility generally is not. It's a
Right.
management.
But I think it's easier to group those things under leadership, right?
Right, right.
Under your leadership effectiveness, right? Like you talk about time management. Is that a management skill? Is that a leadership skill? I mean, these things kind of, they have dual purposes. Um, but they impact your effectiveness to help others execute. That's the bottom line. And leaders or managers, however you want to call them, I consider managers to have some leadership responsibilities. And it just varies the amount of leadership responsibilities they have. Um, so the training may vary depending upon what level they are, but for sure, there needs to be a focus on developing those skills. It makes them more effective at managing when they have some of these leadership skills. And so again, we're talking about effectiveness and helping prevent, some of the drag that we've kind of talked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had mentioned that there's a story that about a SWOT analysis early in your career that ended up costing you thousands. So
Yeah.
can you kind of walk us through what happened and how that shaped the way you think about strategy today?
Yeah, it happened a long time ago. So after I got out of the military, I went back to college, and then my first job was in the pharmaceutical industry. And so I had not been in my territory very long. I'd gone through kind of the medical training components of it, to learn my products and that kind of side. I was on the sales side, and so our first quarterly meeting, we have a SWOT analysis, which I had not even heard of before. And so I don't know much about my territory. I hadn't really been in my territory yet. So I didn't know what the challenges were. I didn't know the physicians. I didn't really know anything about it. So, they'd set up like a 2-hour time frame for us all. We each had our own territories or districts. We had to kind of develop these strategic plans around. So, you go through the general SWOT, what's the straight lead is. I don't have any information. I'm just listening to everybody else. And they say general things like, okay, we're going to spend 80% of our time with at the top 20 physicians who have the largest patient populations in our therapeutic areas, or we're going to spend 80% of our budgets on the top, 20%, those types of things. So I'm like, oh, that sounds good. Let's do that. And then, so you spend a little bit of time on that, and I'm just kind of taking it all in, and you give those back to our regional manager or whatever. And she says, okay, I'll type these up and, we'll get them back to you. Well, I didn't see that for a year. Right. So, I get out into my territory and I start learning, that there's some larger challenges. And one of them was a huge issue, which is that one of the biggest healthcare providers, and they have formularies of which drugs are approved. Ours had been kicked off. Mine had been kicked off, and a competitor had been put on there. So I changed my strategy. I'm like, well, they can't write my drug without going through hoops, and they're not going to write my drug without failing on everybody else's first. So I kind of changed my strategy and said, okay, I'm going to focus on the individuals who can write my drug and spend my money and time with them, which seems pretty logical. And I did pretty well. So we get to the end of the year, and I'm like at 95% goal after having a huge formulary change. And then she pulls out the SWOT and she'd attached goals to these. And these were the things you said you were going to do, and you didn't do these things. And so I lost thousands of dollars in bonus, and so from that situation alone, right, that was very early in my professional business career, right? I learned a lot about if you don't have good information, you have a crappy strategic plan, right? I already kind of referred to that. If you're not flexible enough to understand that things change, and you need to change your strategy and change your tactics, you need to build in awareness of that. And as a leader, you should be aware of those challenges. And at no point was I getting any real, assistance in helping me overcome that stuff. And then certainly to tie my end of year bonuses to things that happened a year before. So, even in this conversation, you can see where that one situation impacted my philosophy around strategic planning a lot, right? And my philosophy around leadership and how to help people be much more mindful of what challenges they're really facing, and how I wish I would have had someone who would have been more supportive and engaged and, to help me during that journey. Not just because of the financial components, but just, my performance impacted her performance, right? Because she's based on on how all of us are doing. So it impacted her too. So, it did. It taught me a lot about, what became much more, defined frameworks over time. But certainly that influenced my philosophy and opinions on the importance of strategic clarity and flexibility really, really early on in my business and professional career.
Yeah, that's coming up with that SWOT analysis, and then at the end of the year, so there, we talk about, you talk about that too, exactly, having that manager or whoever that's engaged,
Right.
you finding out what your goals were at the end of the year, after you did a SWOT analysis and then pivoted,
I didn't even know they were
but
goals. I was just like, like,
right, like where was, where were these meetings throughout the course of the year to follow up to see how you were doing?
right. Well, we had meetings, but we never talked about the SWOT. Again, it just went someplace, and I thought, okay, well, I don't know what this looks like. This process looks
Oh
like.
man, yeah,
Um, so yeah, but I don't think it's unusual. I think this happens a lot, and you asked me a question earlier about how some of this pops up in organizations. Like where do you see some of these signs of where the lack of strategic clarity is impacting? It shows up there. What did I do? I went off on my own. I started using my own rowboat to go where I thought the destination was, because there wasn't clarity and there wasn't a reanalysis or a reevaluation of where we needed to go, or there wasn't checkpoints made to say, hey, are we still in alignment? And so you're just letting the a member of the boat steer the boat, and there should have been a leader there steering that boat a little bit. So yeah, you learn a lot from that, but I don't think it's unusual. And I think it impacts everybody's performance when you don't have those structures and those processes built in.
yeah. If it's going to be tied to a performance evaluation, like, you need to have those. So as part of the performance evaluation system that we created at one of my previous employments, we worked in quarterly reviews. So the managers actually had to go in and go through the quarterly reviews, document where they were
Right.
on the thing. It wasn't an evaluation. It was just to check in. Where are they on their goals? What are they doing here?
Right.
So they had to check in with them on a quarterly basis at a minimum,
Right.
and that's what it was. And, even just something like that, it just, again, creating clarity, creating those expectations for yourself and then also for your employees as well. So important, and
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it needs to have more than quarterly. I'm a
yeah,
big,
yeah.
I don't want to have meetings for meetings sake, but I have no issue. I used to have two standing meetings all the time. One was on Tuesday mornings. What is everybody's major objectives this week? Right. And they would kind of run their own similar meeting for their group. Right. Okay. What are the major focuses? What challenges or obstacles are you anticipating? Is there anything you need from me? And then the Friday was, how do we do? Where are we at?
Mhm.
What did you find? What happened? And then, Monday you come back and you get through all your BS that you got to do on a Monday. And then, you kind of realign. And on Tuesday morning, where are we headed? And if you make it part of your process, it doesn't feel like you need a quarterly, because you already know, where you're headed. And you're already having these constant check-ins, and that's more of a conversation, right? And I think that when something happens or shit hits the fan, you're not so nervous about going to your
Yeah.
superior leader, because you're like, hey, this has popped up. I want you to be aware of it. Here's, what are our options here? And I think that makes a lot easier, flexible environment, I think, to an ongoing, environment to tackle these types of things and to make steady progress. I think we treat it too much like an evaluation all the time. And that's unfortunate. I think we missed the opportunity there to learn of things earlier and to make changes, faster when we have those kinds of processes in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And the quarterly, again, it was just a formal
Yeah, sure.
quarterly
Yeah.
review. But I mean, but the recommendation is always, I mean, if you can meet for, I mean, I was with my team when I first have a new team member on, it's 15 minutes every single day for the first 2 weeks, and then we
Yeah,
start to taper until we get to 30 minutes once a month,
I
and
agree.
that's what it is. It's the 30 minutes once a month. If you need more time, like, I'm available,
Right.
If you need more time, you just let me know.
But you'd be
And
shocked at how many places don't have any of that. They don't have quarterly, they don't have monthly, they don't have weekly, they don't have any, any kind of checkpoints. And then you get to the situation where here's your goals. Like,
you missed them all, and you're like,
right,
I'm
yeah,
not going to
right.
go
You
next
only hit
year.
70% of them, therefore, whatever it was.
That's so funny. I mean, it's not funny, but
Right,
it's
but
funny to look back at now. But it's just,
for
it's
sure.
I only laugh because I've seen it. Like
Right.
I
We all see
understand
it,
it.
right?
Yeah, and
Then
it's
we're shocked that it still happens.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, let's talk. Let's kind of pivot a little bit too, because I know that we're talking a little bit about technology management, talk a little bit about AI and how
yeah.
important it is for managers and leaders to really be up to date with it. And me, I'm very big into AI, different platforms. So you are also helping leaders integrate AI into their workflows, and you're really honest about how it humbled you at first. So what did that wake up call teach you about where leadership is
Yeah, I think, the transition from, nonprofit CEO to consultant again was a big one, right? And it kind of presented itself in a couple different ways. One was during a strategic planning session. I was working with a large organization and they started talking about automation. ChatGPT wasn't really out yet, but they were talking about a lot of, integrations and, you know, assistants. They weren't calling them AI assistants yet, but they were assistants. And I didn't know what a lot of these things were, which was pretty humbling, right? Because you're supposed to be helping them, kind of do a strategic plan. And I'm like, am I writing this? I even have the right verbiage down. I'm going to get found out real quick here. So that was the first wake up call, right? Just all of this, the different complexity of just how they were utilizing automation. um, but I think the real kind of wake up call for me was when I started having to do all this stuff by yourself. There's so much to do, and as running your own business, right? There's so much to do. You have to do your own strategic plan. You have to do your own brainstorm, your own marketing. You have to come up with your ideal client profiles. You have to think about, what are your processes for, lead generation, for lead onboarding, right? For, your contracts. There's just so much, right? And every time you interact with a client, um, it takes time to go through that process to even figure out, whether you want to work together. So there's just a lot of, I don't want to say wasted time, but there's a lot of inefficiencies naturally. And and so that was one of my first wake up calls is, look, I got to get my head around some of this stuff. Because if I don't, I just don't know that I can do it. I just felt like I was drowning every day with a million things to do. And, I felt myself being constantly distracted. And so, uh, I really started digging into, language learning models. I really started digging into automation. What does that mean? AI driven automation. How does that help my workflows? How does that help me be more efficient? I learned how to build an AI driven chatbot, an assistant that helped. First of all, it was just helping me, but then I used it and put one on my website so I could start answering questions, started still, helping out with lead generation. And so as I started doing those things myself, and you start consulting and working with groups, you start seeing, that they don't have things, or they have a certain level of resistance or nervousness around just new technology, or they just haven't had the time, right? And I am like you. I am a believer now that AI. I mean, it is now a critical leadership skill. Like, I don't think AI is going to replace leaders, but I think leaders who understand AI are going to replace leaders who don't. And if you constantly think about, kind of what I've been talking about, these three elements, they really help each other, right? Strategic clarity, leadership effectiveness, and AI or any kind of tech driven, literacy and leveraging, because it frees up time, and you can free up time, and you're not as distracted, you can really focus on your effectiveness as a leader, right? So these things really compound each other over time. And so now I've found a lot of my time working with leaders is kind of been in that category. Uh, um, and it's an area of drag, right? If you're not being efficient, if you're doing things the old way, if you're not updating your processes, you're wasting your own time for something that could be doing it for you. And that's the huge, I think, takeaway for people is that your time costs money in some way, right? At work. And if you're doing things that could be done for you, especially with AI, why would you do that? Because it makes you more effective to do other things and spend your time on things that are much more important, like helping your team be more effective, as opposed to, you know, um, working through these processes. And it helps them become more effective by teaching them how to utilize and leverage new technology. So to me, it's become a critical part of kind of what I call kind of the mammoth, performance cycle, which is these three things all the time, constantly evaluating, where there are opportunities for improvement and where the drag is, and how you can, kind of minimize some of those areas of drag to make yourself and your team more effective.
Yeah. Yeah. And and then just so, for exactly what you're talking about in terms of like leaders and learning these AI skills. I mean, I use AI on this podcast.
Yeah,
It's I use AI to, you know, for me, specifically for my voice because I say like a
right.
lot. So,
Yeah, please take my
but I
ad as
mean,
well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, but I mean,
Right.
this particular platform, all I need to do is click a button and it takes it all out.
Right.
So I don't have to go through, the full cycle or the full conversation going, okay, let's edit here, let's edit here. If there's dead space, I can edit that out.
Yeah, it's amazing.
If I need to enhance the voices, it's just a button. It's an AI
Right.
enhanced voice, it just makes it feasible for me because I don't have an editor, somebody
Right.
that's going to figure and edit. It makes it feasible for me to be able to do this podcast almost on a weekly basis, because of that technology that's in there that's already integrated.
And
And
it's
I think that,
advancing so fast. I mean, in every capacity. I mean, I'm teaching a class right now that's called Career Readiness in the Digital Age, which it's really an undergraduate class that's focused on, AI and LinkedIn and Canva, some of these things that they haven't really even used, but how they incorporate AI into all of those things. And one of the final projects that I have, which has been super awesome for me because it's the third semester that I've now done this class or a version of this class, is I have them all go out and find a new a new AI tool, and then they have to learn about it, teach about it, talk about its pros and cons and whether or not we should use it. I learned 15 new, they get exposed to 15 new AI tools every semester, which is awesome. But you're like, oh my gosh, the amount, I mean, it's always new. I mean, the rate at which there's new tools coming out is unbelievable. Um, and so I think it makes the point, right? I mean, there are so many different ways that it can affect your business and your efficiency and your productivity that as leaders, we have to be constantly mindful and create the time to learn about what's out there and how we can utilize it and leverage it to make ourselves more efficient and our teams more efficient. Because if we don't, we're going to get beat by competitors or other people who are leveraging it and using it. So it's such a critical point now that um, I hope people listen to that, and I hope L&D and HR and a lot of these departments think about how they start incorporating that into their training as well, because it can have incredible impacts on a very short time frame. So critical right now.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I don't think everybody needs to know AI, but I definitely think that leaders and managers really should, and it will really put you at a better advantage moving forward, and not even in terms of job promotions, just in terms of leadership effectiveness. Like you'll be a better leader based on understanding these technologies, not necessarily using them, but really, really understanding these technologies.
Yeah,
You know,
and I would even, I have kind of changed my philosophy on that too, Kenneth, over time. Excuse me. I think the more that you start like customer, I can't tell you how many frontline, office people get bombarded with the same questions over and over and over again. And just developing, an AI assisted bot that can, provide instant access to information or to individuals that are looking for information, how much time that frees up for that person to work on other things. It makes them more efficient. Um, I think everyone should learn how to, get better prompt engineering because there's always opportunities to improve workflows, at every level of the organization. Now, I'm not saying to become overly relying upon it. I'm not saying they don't have ethics around it. I'm not saying you don't have some, some safeguards in place to make sure that, what's being created is useful and valid and authentic and honest and correct. But I do think that, it is evolving so fast that everyone would benefit from some basic understanding of knowledge of how it works and how to utilize it to help their job, and that can be kind of tiered in terms of how much knowledge and training they need. And for me, as I bring on new staff and I talk to other organizations, the speed at which they can get their employees, I guess, educated and learning to leverage it, the more efficient it makes everybody. And that frees up so much more time to spend on other objectives, right? And so it's kind of an arms race, I think, in my opinion. How fast can you get your organization up and running and utilizing AI across the board? Because if you can be better than your competitor, then you're going to make more progress. Yeah, I mean, it's here. It's not going anywhere. So.
Oh, it's definitely not. It's definitely not. So, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your modern leadership scorecard.
Okay.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the modern leadership scorecard.
Hmm.
So, what made you want to build it, and how can something like this actually help leaders identify what's holding them back without overwhelming them?
Yeah, great question. And I think to answer your first question, it was to help identify drag, right? That's the real main purpose of it. I call it the Modern Leadership Scorecard because it really focuses on those three topics that we've been talking about: strategic clarity, leadership effectiveness, and tech, literacy and leveraging. And so, I know how many assessments we've had to take over the years, and there's a lot, and some of them are very complex. So I really developed the scorecard to help leaders get a very quick, rapid assessment of their behavior and knowledge around those specific topics, right? So it's behavior based. So it's 21 questions. It takes you about 3 minutes to do. And it's really like, hey, strategic clarity. It'll ask you, you sometimes do this, you never do this, you do this all the time, right? It's just a quick kind of evaluation. But from those, there's 7 questions in each category. But from that, it kicks out a report that basically says, hey, look, here, based upon the information that you've provided, assuming that you're being honest about your utilization and understanding of these areas, here's where the largest portions of drag are for you. And everyone's going to have them. It's just going to be at what level, and so you may have, AI may be an area, or tech literacy may be an area that's a lot of drag for you right now. Then it has some advice for how to start minimizing and taking some small steps, incremental steps to helping improve and minimizing that drag. If it's around leadership effectiveness, and maybe helping you identify 1 or 2 areas, right, in your leadership that you might be able to start kind of focusing on. And it's more about just bringing about awareness. Again, I don't look at any of these things as ever reaching the end, right? AI is going to continue to develop. Leadership effectiveness is going to continue, to evolve, and you're going to be able to develop in that area. And your strategic clarity constantly needs evaluation. So I think, if anything, it serves as a reminder. Oh, yeah, here's some areas that I need to. It's a no shit moment, right? Oh, here's a self-assessment tool that gives me feedback, and I can choose how I want to engage with that information. I encourage everyone to take it. I have my students take it. I take my clients take it. I think everyone should take it, because it is kind of that OS moment, right? I think it's. I take it again, and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about that question. I probably need to spend a little more time on that. And then you can build a developmental plan, or you can go out and do your own research, or you can, build it into your organization, or seek your own information on LinkedIn or some of these other resources, or hire someone, like us to come help you improve in those areas. But I think that's the purpose of it, is to get a very quick feedback on what might be slowing you down, and what you can do to overcome that drag to kind of get you to your goals faster.
So for listeners that are here, is there a direct link to the Modern Leadership Scorecard, or is it on the Mammoth? Is it MammothSuccess.com?
So there's 2 places. Well, you can find it. It's in the book if you wanted to do that. But I think there's 2 easy ways, and I don't know if you can drop this into the podcast notes when you do it. if you go to my website, mammothdevelopment.com, there's a link right at the top, to the modern leadership scorecard. It's really simple. I can give you the link. Anybody can click on it. Like I said, it takes you 3 minutes. You keep the results. I'm not going to be hounding you about things, but I think it's for you. It's for people to get some feedback, and some self-identification around where they may need to spend a little time and invest some time on improvement. And, I think we're wired that way, right? From OD. It's like, how do we constantly evaluate, what is holding us back, our organizations back, our teams back? And so, there's a lot of assessment tools out there, but I didn't want it to be something that would weigh you down. I wanted it to be something that was as easy as possible for people to take and kind of get that feedback. And so, I'll make sure you have the link, and it's super easy. And I think people get a lot of benefit from it.
Excellent. And I'll make sure I have all of your show notes, all of
Great.
your links in the show notes. So,
Perfect.
so for the listeners that are interested, absolutely, the show notes will be there, and
Great.
we'll definitely connect with Marcus. So Marcus, so we're gonna wrap up here, okay? So I'm gonna ask you a question. If you have to sum up your whole approach to leadership in one sentence or phrase, something you want a client to walk away with, walk away remembering, what would it be?
Yeah, I think the phrase would be this, and I don't know that it's just for me, right? I think it is, if you want to get results faster, you need to take time to analyze, what is holding you back, right? What is the performance drag, and how can you eliminate that? So I don't know if that accomplished that in one phrase or not, but I think the main concept is the importance and the interconnection between strategic clarity, leadership effectiveness, and really tech-driven, leveraging tech to improve efficiency. And if you can constantly be focused on those things, whether it's working with me or working with anyone, right, or your organization or yourself for that matter, I think you'll see that you'll make more regular progress towards your goals. And if you're not, take the scorecard, learn what's holding you back, and make some plans to kind of work on some of those things, and you'll continue to make progress.
Marcus, thank you. Marcus, I want to thank you for being here today. This has been such a great conversation for me, and I always love these conversations because I always take information, I gain some insight from it. So I really, really appreciate you being here, being a guest on the show. And yeah, I look forward to many more conversations with you. And,
Good.
Well,
and let me finish by saying this too. Kenneth, I'm going to say this again: how valuable I think these types of shows are, and I do want to encourage anyone in the ODHR world or realm to reach out. I think we need more connection. And more conversations like this, not for clients. I'm not talking about from that perspective. I think these types of conversations are healthy. I think we have the opportunity to learn from a lot of each other's experience about what's currently, the challenges that they're facing, whether they're an internal or external, OD practitioner. And yeah, I think it's really important for people outside our little world, to hear about some of these conversations and to start to get a better grasp of the value that we can offer, not just leaders, but, organizations as a whole. So thank you for creating this platform. And I look forward to conversations on and off, your podcast moving forward. So thanks so much, Kenneth.
I appreciate it, Marcus. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Unboxing OD. My thanks to Marcus for bringing clarity, candor, and a practical lens for thinking about modern leadership. If something in this conversation sparked a shift for you, whether it's how you run a one-on-one, how you define expectations, or how you approach technology, carry that into your next week and see what changes. All of the links mentioned in this episode, including Marcus's Modern Leadership Scorecard and ways to connect, are in the show notes. If you're sharing this episode with a colleague, invite them to reflect on one question. Where is the drag? And what is the first step they can take to reduce it? Until next time, keep seeking clarity, keep eliminating drag, and keep unboxing organizational development. Take care.